Welcome. I hope you enjoy the rest of the days. We've got a lot of sessions for you, and everybody that's here for whatever the second, third, or fourth time, welcome back. A lot of cool stuff they're going to be walking through and talking about. So this session is about IAM best practices. My name is Anders Samuelsson. I work in the IAM team. I was part of launching the first IAM service, and I'm going to be talking about the best practices and all the bits and pieces that come with it. A little bit short of what you can expect for this session. I'm going to talk about the best practices in itself for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then after that, I'm going to go into a section that I call versus. A lot of times when I presented this session before and also on the forums, customers like yourself start asking, well, you got these two technologies that almost does the same thing. When do I use this and when do I use that? So we're going to spend some time on that as well. And demos, of course. Everybody likes demos. So let's get started. By the way, how many are new to AWS that haven't really used it that much? Hands up. OK, cool. So let's just get everybody on the same page to start with. What is IAM? IAM is a service that you use to enable your users to get access to what you want them to have access to in your environment, right? And we give you a number of primitives around it. We give you users, we give you groups, we give you something called roles, and we give you permissions. And if you compare to an operating system that you would run on a host on-premise, it's pretty much the same primitives, except for the roles part. We can put that aside a little bit, but I'll talk about it a fair amount through the presentation. Control. It's centralized. You can go in and set up permissions for all the services in one place. You don't have to go to EC2 to set up permissions. You don't have to go to S3 and set up permissions. Everything is controlled and managed in one place. And you can be fairly fine-grained. You can either set it up almost down to, you can do it to API level, or we call them actions. You can do it to specific resources. And you can control even who can get access to the console. So it's pretty much you controlling what users can do in your environment. Security side, secure by default. You create a user in your environment, and that user cannot do anything unless you grant them permissions to do so. You even have to create the credentials. So just creating a user doesn't mean he can do anything in the system. You can give him permissions, he still can't do anything. Now it still needs credentials. So you're in control of managing and setting it up so that it works for your users. Multiple users, don't create one, don't create two. Create users for everybody that needs access. That gives you the ability of setting individual credentials. You can do individual credential rotation. You can set individual permissions and effectively control, once again, who can do what in your environment. So that's a quick recap of what it is. Most of the people might have already worked on this and know what it is, but I wanted to make sure that we're quickly on the same page. IAM best practices. I'm going to walk through 10 best practices. I've divided them up in 3 sections. One that talks about basic user and permissions management. And the other one that the second one talks about credential management, and the third one where we talk about delegation. And everything that I'm going to talk about is in the IAM documentation. You can go and drill down into excruciating details on every single one, but I'll cover them at a high level and walk you through them. So basic user and permission management. This is one of those just basic security hygiene things. Create individual users. Do not create one user and give those permissions to 10 people, right? Create individual users, just gives you better control. You can give them individual permissions and individual credentials. They can rotate their credentials, which is an important one we'll come to later. Right. Grant least privilege. Don't just give them EC2 star. Don't just give them S3 star. Don't give a user everything so they can do things in your environment. Make sure that they only get the permissions that are required for them to do their job. Right. Benefit out of that is it's easier to relax than tighten up. So if you are a little bit too tight when you set the permissions, you can always open it up later. It's easier to open up than to tighten up. Take things away is always hard. And it gives you more granular control. How do you set permissions? Well, you can do it in different ways. You can set permissions directly on users if you want. But we usually recommend, as a best practice, use groups. Use groups as a way of logically grouping the people that are going to use your environment. It might be that you already have defined groups within your organization. This is project A. This is my team, FooBar. Create those groups. Put your users in those groups, and then put permissions on them. It also allows you to move people between roles in case they change their responsibility within your organization. Move them from one group to another, and their permissions are now better used. There are a lot of chairs up front if you want to come and sit down. Restrict privileged access through conditions. So the first three I talked about, you create a user, least privilege, and you set permissions. You can pretty much use those, and you can go home and you've done your homework, and everything is pretty well understood. We give you some more knobs you can tweak. Conditions. So if you want an example, restrict so that access to specific resource in your environment requires that they try to access it from your enterprise network. You can provide a condition on the rule that says, for this source IP only, or require MFA is used for accessing a specific resource, or that you're coming in over SSL. Now you got to think about it, the more you restrict it, the harder it is to use in the environment as well. So this is where you have to balance usability and security, and sometimes they do not go hand in hand. Create users, use groups to put permissions in, use conditions and restricting it further. Now you've got the base primitives of controlling who can do what. The fifth one, that is a more important one, is really, there we go. You should enable CloudTrail. Enable CloudTrail in your account to make sure that you can track who has done what in your account. First one gives you control of who does what. The second one is to actually go and look who has done what. It also gives you a debugging mechanism. If somebody gets an access denied, you can go and look in the CloudTrail log to understand why did they get that access denied. Let's walk into the next bucket, credential management. So as I said, users do not get credentials by default. You have to create them. A user cannot do anything by default unless you grant them permissions to do so. But that also means you need to be careful with regards to credentials. Normally, if you have an enterprise, you want to make sure that credentials are rotated, and you probably have some sort of policy with regards to your passwords. They have to have at least a capital letter, a small letter. It has to have an alphanumeric character. It might be 10 characters long, whatever it is. Set a strong password policy. You could do that within AWS as well. There are ways of doing that, and I'll demo that in a bit. Which gets me to the next one. Rotate credentials regularly. Now, we provide two sets of credentials for users. If you have an on-premise environment, it's usually one set. You have a username and a password. In AWS, you have username, password, but you can also have access keys. And you should make sure that you rotate both set of credentials. Don't just set up so you rotate passwords. You've got to rotate the credential, the access keys as well. And that is slightly cumbersome, but it is a very good security hygiene to think about. And I'll go through the details of it and actually show you the steps you should go through when you rotate them, because they're slightly different from rotating passwords. But rotate both credentials. Don't set up a policy for passwords. If you're using access keys, make sure you rotate those as well. MFA for privileged users, another best practice. If you've got users that have access to information or data or systems in your AWS environment that you consider being crucial to your organization, you should probably make sure that those users have an MFA assigned and require that that is used when they sign in. You have your own definition of what a privileged user is. I can't define that for you. But a lot of times what I've seen what a lot of customers do is anybody that has any kind of IAM permissions, create user, create policy. Usually those are considered privileged users. Make sure they have an MFA assigned. Excuse me. And there's different form factors. You can have a hardware device, which are provided by Gemalto, and if you want to see what they look like, they're actually down in the exhibition hall showing off some of their form factors. You can either have a key fob, they have a credit card-sized MFA as well, or if you want to, use a software MFA. Use your phone and download some software on it, and you can run. I got Google Authenticator as an example, and that works fine for me. Delegation. So we talked about creating users and credentials. So now you can manage your environment within an account. That gives you a lot of control, and as I said, you can be very granular down to exactly very specific resource that you want to control access to. But a lot of times, there are people or users outside of your account that needs access. And this is what we call delegation. One of the key things I want you to take away from going out of the session is never share access keys, never share credentials with anybody that needs access. The best practice for you is to use what we call IAM roles. So you set up a role, and through the role you define who you trust. So you set up a trust relationship. It could be a trust relationship with another AWS account. And you also now control that. You can easily cut it off. But there's no sharing of secrets. You just tell the other account owner saying here's the name of the role, this is what my account is called, you can now use and access that information that I've given you access to. No secrets shared. You can give them on a yellow sticky note, whatever it is. If that goes off and somebody else takes it, there's no way they can get access in because you're in control. So use roles as a way of sharing access. And you can see there's a number of use cases I brought up here. There's like cross-account access. I just talked about that. You can use this also within an account. Give somebody some admin permissions for a while using a role, and also use through federation that we'll get to in a little bit. Now, the benefit of this as well is when you use a role, these are temporary credentials that expire. And you get the benefit of what we talked about previously, credential rotation, which means they expire. I have to ask for new credentials if I want access. It's not anything that has to be stored and saved away anywhere. Roles for EC2. How many in the room run applications on EC2 that needs to access other services? How many uses roles for EC2? About the same. For anybody that, if you're not using roles for EC2 and you have applications running on your instances and they need access to other services, you should look at this. It will take away a lot of the security concerns and management for you. And it's fairly easy to set up. You create a role, you define what your application needs as permissions. If the only thing it's going to do is read from an S3 bucket, set it up so it reads from an S3 bucket. And you launch your instance. You do a run instance the normal way you do, but you specify the role and say, I want to launch with this role. Now your application, if it's developed with the SDK, you don't have to do anything. It just runs. It will automatically figure out what the access keys are and use those access keys that's associated with the role to get to the data. There's no need for you to copy access keys out to the instance. There's no need for you to burn the access keys into the instance. Please do not do that. Best practice, use these roles for EC2. It's a really cool thing that we built. A question of conscience. How many people in the room are still using root to access their AWS account? And yes, please raise your hand. This is incredible. Nobody raised their hand. Or did I miss somebody? Oh, yes, thank you. There's always one. When I did this talk the first time, basically half the room were using root. It's good to see the progress. Now, the saying is, do not ever use root if you can. Avoid it, right? Delete access keys from root. Put in a long password that whatever the length of you want it is. Lock it down with an MFA and lock that MFA into a safe. You should never have to use root for anything that you're doing within your account. Right? That's the second one. So there's two things to remember from this presentation. One, don't share credentials if you're going to give somebody access outside of your accounts. Use roles. And two, do not use root. So if we quickly look at them, oh, it's actually 11. It's not just 10, it's 11 best practices. We add one every year, so. I still call it top 10 best practices. It sounds more round number and such. There's a bunch of them up there. I'm not going to go through every single one again, but all of these are described in more detail in the IAM documentation. But if you follow this, you're pretty much set for setting up your environment. And as I said, there's not much in here that is rocket science. If you manage an environment on-premise with users and what they can access, it's pretty much the same thing. We provide an additional set of credentials, which you usually don't have on-premise, but that's really the biggest difference that you have. So, having said that, when should I use something? I've given this talk enough many times, and I've talked enough about customers that every single time all these questions come up. Well, when do I use IAM users? When do I use federated users? You've got these inline policies and there's managed policies. When do I use what? Let's walk through some of these and give you some advice and give you some best practices on when to use what. When should I use IAM users and when do I use federated users? So let's talk a little bit about the difference. IAM user is a user you manage within your account. And a federated user is somebody that is managed in a different identity environment outside of your account that you want to grant access to. Right? Let's use that as a definition of what we're talking about. So of course, as a best practice, what do you use when? Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you want to manage all your users in one spot, and that's how you control it, so make sure that if somebody leaves your organization, they lose access to all the kind of information they had previously, you should probably be looking at federated users. If you don't have an environment you're managing, if you're a very small startup and you're managing your users, they have their own laptop and whatever it is, you might want to look at using IAM users. It's probably the best way to start with, at least, to get going. Right? But there's other use cases that are related to this. As I said, whenever you want to delegate access into your account, you're really federating it. Even if it's a user from another AWS account, it's still federation. It's managed elsewhere, and I'm giving them access into my environment. And if you're developing mobile applications, please, please, please do not hard code the access keys into your app and make sure it's distributed to 100,000 telephones. That's not the right approach. Use federation, use delegation. There's a service called AWS Cognito. You should look at that. That helps you with all this kind of stuff. Really what all this boils down to is, whenever you can, use federated access. Why? You get the credential rotation for free, you manage your identities in one place, and you have better control over your environment. Right. And as I said, I can't repeat this enough. Please do not share credentials. We've seen enough cases where this has happened, and customers are not aware really what they're doing, and they forget the credentials are out there, and somebody gets access to things they don't want to get to. So as much as possible, use roles and use federated access to get into the account. So how does federated access work? Quickly walk through this. And I'm going to use a sample where I have two different accounts. I have a dev account that has a user, Anders, that's me. And I have another account, prod, where I have a DynamoDB table or DynamoDB database that I want Anders to get access to. So what do I need to do? Well, as an administrator, I need to create a role in the account that has the resource. I need to assign it two policies. And I talked about one that was trust. It's really a policy that defines who can assume this role, who am I delegating the access to. In this case, it's a very simple one. It says users in account dev can get access. If you look at the account ID, it's basically the account number. It's the same one that I have up there, right? I could, if I wanted to be very specific, and call out Anders, but I'm making a simple policy here. Secondly, I need to define what can the role do, or what can the user that's federating in actually do. And this is a read-only DynamoDB policy, if you look at it. So it's really saying is, well, Anders can go in and do a bunch of stuff on any table in DynamoDB in this account. So I'm now done in the account that has the resource. Now I've set up the federation, I've set up trust. Anders also needs to get some permissions, right? Remember, he can't do anything unless you give him permissions to do so. There's no magic in this. So I need to define a policy, which is on the left-hand side, left-hand side, that basically says Anders can assume the role, DynamoDB role over in the project account. I'm all set. Both sides are set up appropriately. So what happens now? Well, there's basically a handshake that's going to go on. What's basically going to happen is a credential exchange between two different entities, two different identity providers. So Anders calls in with his access keys and says, I want to assume a role. I want to assume the DynamoDB role. And given that the permissions, the trust policy we talked about previously says he can't come in, he gets a set of access keys back. And these are temporary access keys. They're only valid for 1 hour. After 1 hour, he has to request new access keys. Once again, you get the credential rotation, right? So he gets those access keys back that are related to the role, and then he uses those access keys to call in and access DynamoDB. As I said, it's a credential exchange. I come in with one set of credentials, and I get another set of credentials back that I can use to access the resource. Now, what I've just drawn, it says between two accounts. This is exactly the same handshake that happens if you're coming in through SAML or any other identity provider that we support. It doesn't have to be for an AWS account, but it's pretty much the same standard set. I come in, I assume a role, I get credentials back, and I use those credentials to go in and access a resource. I'll take questions later. So, talking about access keys. When do I use access keys and when do I use passwords? Well, if you're using AWS today, you sort of like know pretty much what it is. If somebody needs to get access to your console, you need to give them a password. But if that's the only thing they need access to, don't create access keys. Right? If the only thing they're going to access is the console, the only thing they need is a password, do not create access keys in that case. On the other hand, if the only thing they're going to do is run an application that calls service APIs, guess what? You need to give them access keys, but don't give them a password. If they need both, you need to give them both, but only give them the credentials that are required. Don't go in overboard and go in and create a bunch of stuff, because you need to make sure that those things are rotated in that case. This is what I'm going to get to now, which is one of the important ones. I talked about it before, and I sound like a broken record, really. Make sure you rotate the credentials. There is a tool called the credential report that actually will tell you what the status of your credentials in your AWS account is. It will tell you what credentials every individual user has, when they last used them, and when they last changed them. In other words, rotated the credentials. That way you can use this report to look over your identity space in the account and see, like, is there any access keys that haven't been used for quite a while? Maybe you can inactivate them. etc. Configure password policy, we talked about this before. That actually will allow you to set up rules that govern when they actually have to rotate their password. And configure a policy for access key rotation. So this doesn't come by default. Once again, you need to give a user permissions to do it. And this is really what a policy looks like. It's a very simple policy. If you take this and assign it to a group, remember, use groups for permissions, assign it to a group, and you put your users in it that have access keys, this will give them the right to modify and change and rotate their own access keys. They can't change anybody else. Text that's in red at the bottom that says username, that is what we call a policy variable, and it gets replaced at runtime with the username of the individual that is accessing the APIs to go and rotate the access keys, and we'll validate to make sure that it actually matches. So if Anders, in this case, tried to change access keys on a user, Bob, it wouldn't work because the policy wouldn't allow him to do so. Now, to rotate access keys, there are 5 steps you need to go through. And this is what I'm saying, it's different from rotating with regards to passwords. 1, while you still have the old or the original access keys up and running and still working, create a new set of access keys. Please do not inactivate the old ones yet. 2, update your applications so they use the new set of access keys, right? And now you start testing it and validate that they actually work, right? Go back and inactivate the first set of active keys. Don't delete them yet, just inactivate them. What that means is you can't use them. You basically get valid access key back. But you haven't deleted, you haven't killed yourself, you have shot yourself in the foot yet. When you have tested all your applications, you believe you're up and running appropriately, and that is up to you how long you want to do that, you go back and you then delete the original access keys. Now, the period when you test, it's up to you. If you want to do it over 1 day, you want to do it over 2 weeks or 4 weeks, it's a little bit up to you how long you think you need in your environment. But the important part is, at the end, you should delete the original access keys. Don't let credentials lie around, right? By mistake, we've seen enough, even in my organization, by mistake you go in and activate an access key that's laying around, and suddenly there's an access key that's floating around somewhere somebody can use. Right? So delete access keys when they're not used. Show and tell, demo, yay. So real quick, what I'm gonna show here. So I'm signed in as an administrator into my account, and I wanted to start and show off the credential report. And it's fairly easy. It's an Excel spreadsheet that you essentially load down. And gives you all the information that's necessary for you to look at. And let's do this real quick. Let's make it a little bit larger. So as you can see in here, there's a user here called Anders, and there's a user called Bob, and there's a user called Isengard. For anybody that noticed up in the right-hand corner, my account is Viking, so there's a theme here with Nordic mythology. So I like those. There's also the root account. So you get some data on the root account, not everything that you have with regards to credential rotation, but we're working on it. We're getting there. So in this Anders, you can actually go and see last time when Anders was created. You can tell if they have a password assigned or not. So in this case, Isengard does not have a password, so he can't sign in through the console. You can also see when the password was created, when the password was last used, when it was last changed, and also when is the next rotation about to happen. Right? So imagine you have 100 users, you can actually go and get a status of where they are with regards to their credential rotation. And the same is true for access keys. If we go a little bit to the right-hand side, and you'll see here, basically it says access key 1, and over here somewhere it should say access key 2. The reason you have 2 access keys per user is so that you can actually do the credential rotation. It's very hard to do credential rotation if you only had 1 set. So you have 2 access keys that can be active at any given time on a user. And it's there for helping you smoothly transition and do a credential rotation. But the same thing here, you can see whether if they have an access key design. You can see there's all 3 of these users do. You can see when it was last created or last rotated. And basically, I've rotated some of these just for the demo. And if we go to the right-hand side, you can see there's 1 set of access keys, the ones that I have here. You can see which region it was last used in and which service was the last one that it actually called. So you get a lot of information out of this. It's worth looking at, and it gets updated every couple of hours to get the kind of information that's in there. Don't call it on a regular basis, like every minute. takes a couple of hours, like 4 hours in between, they get updated. But it definitely is a good report to look at and look at your credentials, make sure that they're being rotated actively. The second thing I wanted to show is the password policy. It's under account settings. So password policy, as I said, is really pretty much what you can do within an organization or a normal operating system that you have on premise, right? I can set how long it is, it needs to be in uppercase or lowercase, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that I have set on my account, as an example, is I've got a 90-day rotation, which actually forces the user to change the password. And there's a grace period when user gets notified when the sign-in saying is you have X number of days left, then you need to rotate your credentials. You can also go into set, which is down here, prevent password reuse, and you can define how many passwords will I remember as part of the activity that they're doing. So you could have the password rotation once a month and require that they have to provide a new password, remember 12 passwords, which means they can't use the same password until a year out. Once again, you're locking down and securing your environment from what they're doing. Let's go back to the presentation. So credential report, very important tool to use. You should be looking at that on a fairly regular basis and seeing what the patterns are and learning from it. Let's go to the next piece. So we have something that's called inline policies and managed policies. The managed policies is a feature we launched back in February, March this year. And the differences are the following. An inline policy is a policy that's attached by value if you talk about programming terminology. It's data that sits directly on the entity. So you delete the entity, the policy gets deleted. Managed policy is a policy that you attach by reference. It's an object like any other object in the IAM space. I can control access to it, I can create it, and I can manage it separately. Right? That's the big differences between these two, and we support both. Which means, when do I use what? Inline policies. Best practice would be to use it if you need, as I said, you need to delete the policy when the user is deleted. If there's a very, very specific relationship between what they should be able to do and the resource, you would use an inline policy. Usually this is a case when there's nobody else that needs access. Then you put an inline policy, attach it to the user, and when they delete the user, the policy goes away, and everything's just nice and handy. It also helps you avoid situations where the wrong policy gets associated with a user, as an example. So it's a very small category of where you actually would use an inline policy. Managed policies is probably the more preferable one, and this is sort of like where we guide you through. If you use our IAM console, it will guide you through and help you set up managed policies instead. So why managed policies? Reusability. You can create a policy before you attach it to anybody. You have it sitting there, and then you can attach it as you please. You can attach it to users, groups, and roles. So you can have the same policy attached to all the different entities that you manage in the IAM space. Right? Central change management and versioning and rollback. Once again, there's a separate tab that allows you to manage, work with the managed policies. You can see the full list, you can create them, and you can use versioning and rollback. Every time you update a managed policy, a new version gets created. So if by mistake you put in the wrong permission, maybe you locked it down too hard, or maybe you opened it up too wide, you can always roll back to the previous version with one click. All right, and I'll demo that in a little bit. We also have you can also delegate permissions management. So I can delegate for somebody that can go and create policies, and then I can give somebody else the permissions of assigning specific policies to users in the system. It could be a project lead, as an example, somebody that's a leader for a project that wants to be able to assign permissions to his or her project, but instead of giving them the right of creating the policy, just give them the right to assign that policy to the people they believe need it, right? Delegation of duty, least privilege as well. They don't have full IAM permissions. We have a vast set of AWS-created managed policies. There's a couple of them for each service. This helps you get started. One of the things we do with those policies are whenever a service launches some new features, we will make sure the policy is updated, which means you don't have to worry about going updating the policy for your users. We've had a lot of customers that have had that situations where service launches a new feature and suddenly the users try to use it and it breaks. That doesn't happen with these policies. The other big thing is larger policy size. Plus, we just about a month or so ago also enabled so you can use more IAM managed policies per entity. I know that's one of the biggest feature requests we've had in a while. So you get larger policy size. Inline policies, I don't remember exactly the size, I think it's 2K. Managed policies is 5K. You can have 5 policies assigned to a user or a group, et cetera. Gives you very big flexibility with regards to the size of the policies. So managed policies is probably the path you should be going down anytime you manage with policy, any kind of permission. Which gets us to the other piece, which is groups and managed policies. And this is an interesting one, because if you think about it, they provide pretty much the same features and the same benefits, right? They can be used to assign the same policy and same permissions to a lot of users. It can be used and centrally managed. As I said, I can create groups. I can put users in groups and move them between groups. Same thing with managed policies, move them between policies, same benefit, same functionality. And if I update a policy, it takes effect for all the users that are associated with a policy. So when do I use which? Well, groups is probably the preferred way of doing it still, right? Usually you want to go and group people that are more logically together. It's a project, it's a team, it might be whatever, the division, something as a way of controlling access, and then you put policies on the group still. And a lot of people use this, and this is normally the way you go and manage. You manage through groups. When would you want to use managed policies instead of groups? Well, if you want to assign a policy to use a group and a role, the same policy to all those 3 entities, you have to use a managed policy. You can't put roles in groups, right? That's really the only distinction in between. What you should do is actually AND them together. That's when you get the full strength and the full manageability and controlling permissions within your environment. Use groups for grouping our users and assign managed policies to control the permissions. Now you can go to an update and you got the version in control. All that list I had previously we compared with inline policies. You get those benefits. A good tip as well is don't try to cram everything into one policy. Look at how you logically can structure up your managed policies. It might be that there's specific network access, or it might be database admin access or database access. Create those smaller chunks and use those as Lego pieces to build the permissions on the groups. That gives you the control, it gives you better manageability, and there's smaller chunks you need to update whenever there's improvements that need to be made. Show and tell, real quick. So let's go back. Sorry, let's do this. So what I want to do here is that we go and look at a user, and I have a user in here called Bob, my favorite user. And Bob right now has 0 permissions associated with him. If you look at it, there's no policies assigned to him. So I'm actually going to attach a very specific policy. And this is what it looks like. Anything that's in orange, the orange cube, that's an AWS managed policy. Everything that doesn't have it, that is a policy that I have created. So I can filter, which makes it easier to see. So as you can see, I got 4 policies. And I'm going to go and sign the S3 policy, and we'll take a look at it real quick. Really what this does is a read-only S3 policy. It gives access to go and read anything in S3 and do things accordingly. So if I now open up, and this is another browser, I'm now signed in as Bob in this browser. And if I go in and select S3, you'll see that I have access, and just to prove that I don't have anything else, let's select EC2, and you'll see I'll get an access denied, show it everywhere, right? So quickly go back to S3. And as I said, it's read-only. I can go drill down, see what this is. I select this, see if I try to do a delete. Of course, it's not going to work and get an access denied at some point. You should get an access denied, so. This is what happens when you demo live. Trust me. So what we're going to do in this case, I'm going to go refresh this. And we're going to go back, and I'm going to change the policy. Let's go back. So I have policies. So remember, he had the S3 policy. And I'm going to do an update it. There it is. See, it says edit. So I cannot quickly go in and add this. And so let's say I realize, well, I thought I'm going to change it. I'm going to add some stuff in here. By mistake, I do this. Basically say S3 everything. So I can delete, create, read, full access to S3, and I save this policy away. If we look at the bottom, we'll see there's 2 versions. If you look at version 1, this is the policy that I previously had to set up. And then there's policy 2, which basically says it's the one that I got assigned now. If you look at the list, it says version 2 is default. And that means this policy is what's being used when you assign the policy to users. Attach the policy. Let's go back to Bob and see what he can do in this case. So let's go in and create a folder, which you said I couldn't do. Oh, let's do this. So I just created a folder. I now have access to it. Well, I just realized I didn't want that to happen. I didn't want him to have S3 full permissions. So I'll go back. Once again, we got the policy. And I don't have to change the policy. This is where I can go in, select version 1, and set as default. That's all I needed to do. It still shows the policy that's last created, but it's not the policy that's effective. If I want, I can go in and take this policy. I can delete it. And the version is gone. And if we do a refresh on this, you can see it's the right policy. So if we now go back to Bob and try to select folder and do delete, it says access denied. So it's a very easy way of rolling back to previous version. And I roll back only one version. If you make a couple of mistakes in a row, or somebody does, you can always roll back to there's 5 versions that we keep track of for you. All right. And a good way is also hygiene is to potentially go and delete the ones that were not the right policies. You get those out of the way. So let's go back to the presentation and continue. So manage policies, strongly recommended. We talked about federated IAM users, use federation as much as possible, which is the next verses. Resource-specific policies and tag-based permissions. And this is also a question that comes up frequently. How do I use what? Once again, it depends on your use case, what you're trying to do. In some cases, a resource-specific policy, in other words, you're calling out explicitly which resource to manage, and the policy is something that you really want, right? And that's really what it boils down to. If you want to be very, very specific, it is this specific instance that Anders can go in and manage. You need to call it out in the policy, and that's what we call a resource-specific policy. On the other hand, if you want to go in and manage resources across a number of services, you can use tags as a way of logically grouping them together, right? And you now base your access based on that tag that's being set. Now, one of the benefits of this is as well is permissions will automatically be enforced on new resources that get the same tag without you having to change the policy, right? So if we look at an example, oh, sorry. One thing I wanted to point out as well, sorry. These are the services right now that support tag-based permissions. So it's one of those you also need to take into account what we support at the moment. We are working with all the services to get the tag-based permissions working, and it will slowly be trickling out over the next couple of months. So, but I want to list these are the ones that are actively working right now. So if we look at an example, take Anders in this case once again, and this is the policy that's assigned to him. And really what it says is, Anders can do anything in EC2 as long as there's a tag project equals to blue assigned to a resource. Right? What does that mean? Well, if there's an instance launched, you have the tag set, of course, Anders gets access. Right? You launch another instance, still has access. It looks, so if you think about it, it's like you created this group, and you start dropping things into it, resources. I just showed the EC2 specific ones, but as soon as somebody keeps adding resources in here, it could be a snapshot, it could be whatever, a VPC, something that is a resource within EC2. Anders gets full control over that piece, right? Somebody adds an instance with project equals to green, there is no access. And I didn't have to change a line of code in my policy to enable this scenario, right? So it's a very powerful way of creating projects within your space and controlling access to it. Once again, if you set this policy as a managed policy, you can assign it to multiple users, and they get access, right? So let's see this in action and see how it works. So let's get back to the admin console. We pick Bob. And I'll leave the S3 policy, that's fine. He can still get the access for S3. Now I have a policy here that I call project equals to blue, and let's assign that and quickly look what it does. And said, it's pretty much what I talked about. I've narrowed it down a little bit to be a little bit more of control, but it's pretty much the same thing. The first couple of lines at the top basically gives the access to the EC2 console without giving us error messages, so we can actually demo this nicely. And the latter one says, I can't terminate, I can't stop, and I can't start instances unless they're tagged with project equals to blue. Right. So if we now go back to Bob, oh, sorry. We'll go to the EC2 console, and we go into instances. You'll see here there's a number of instances that are up and running, and some of them are actually stopped as well. And this is where you see the tag. I have a tag that says project, and here's the value of those tags. And I got a red one, I got a couple of blue ones, and a green one. So Anders has project equals to blue, that was, yeah. So let's take a red one and see what he can do. I'm gonna try and start the red instance. Sorry, can't do, access denied. However, I pick a blue one. Stop this one instead, and that just works fine. So I can now easily create a new instance, just tag it with project equals to blue, and Anders automatically has the right to start and stop and terminate, right? And I don't have to change any of the permissions on Anders, right? What does it mean when we have the resource-based permissions instead? Let's go back to the admin. Let's, in this case, detach this policy. We'll do the filtering. You can see I have one that's called resource permissions. So let's take this policy, assign it to Anders, and quickly look at what it does. So this one calls out a very specific instance, right? Please memorize the number. We're going to have a test on it later, but trust me, it is a real instance. So, and if we go back to Bob, you'll see at the top, the red instance up here has the same number. So it's a very, very specific policy for that specific instance. So if I now go in and pick the one that I previously couldn't start or stop because I only had the blue access, the same thing here, I want to go and do start, it works just fine. On the other hand, I take a blue instance, try to stop it, no go. Right. So it's a very powerful tool. It actually gives you a lot of management benefits out of it. And so you could create this policy, which is a project-specific policy. And once again, you come through delegation as well, so somebody that is the leader for the project can get the right to assign that specific policy, project equals to blue, or project blue, to users in the AWS environment. Give them access to the project, and they automatically get access whenever resources get added or deleted. Is all right. So it's a very interesting policy mechanism for you to manage control. And so this is one that comes up often enough. How many in the room have an environment that have more than one AWS account? How many in the room only have one AWS account? Wow, okay, fair amount. So it comes up often enough that we thought we'd bring this up and give some sort of guidance around how to think about it, what you should be doing, what you should be doing. Every environment is unique, so I can't say that these are rules that everybody should abide by. You need to look at your conditions and what you want to accomplish, but some of the things to think about. When to use a single account. If you don't need to isolate between projects, there's okay if somebody sees resources from another project, right? You want a simpler way of controlling who can do what in your environment. And you don't really care about how the bill is broken up. Everything rolls up to one bill. You don't have to split it up between projects or whatever it is. One account is probably the right option for you. If you're a small company starting up, one account is probably the right way to start with. However, if any of those things are not true and you start looking at it, it becomes more interesting, right? If you need the full isolation, you've got projects that you really want to lock down, and you really don't want anybody to know about these projects. They shouldn't even know, but see the resources. They only see the resources they have access to. You want to have a good breakdown on your bill that could actually relate to the project or the department or the group. Plus, as an example, you might want to also lock away and hide away, isolate the recovery information and your CloudTrail logs. You're most likely going to need multiple accounts, which is probably the reason a lot of you guys have multiple accounts in here. Right? Now, the single bill, the way you solve that is something called consolidated billing. It allows you to consolidate all your accounts in one place, and it gets your bill rolled up. But it doesn't really help with very much else. So you got to think, this is where you need to take into account, do I need multiple accounts or single one? Because there's management overhead with multiple accounts, multiple identity spaces that I need to manage to get things working. What we did provide a couple of, beginning of this year, we actually launched something called Switch Role that allows you to minimize the use of credentials, but still switch between accounts, specifically when you're using the console. Right? And I'm going to bring up a picture you saw previously and walk you through this, and I'm actually going to demo it in a bit. Take the same space. We have the dev account that I created. Anders sits in there, yay. and Anders needs access to 2 different projects, and they're actually 2 separate accounts for isolation reasons. And there's data in there that he needs access to. And what did we say we do? It's an easy one. I need to create roles that have access to the resources. I need to assign a policy to Anders that basically says he can assume the role in the different environments so that he can do the right thing. And now he can get access to the information, right? So you could do this now in the console. So what you do is now you only need to manage 1 set of credentials for the user. You don't have to create a user in every single account for Anders. He doesn't have to remember the password that's in the different accounts. The only thing he needs to remember is 1 username and 1 password from 1 account, and then he can go and switch between the other accounts to do the tasks that are necessary for him to do his job. What you can do with this as well, which makes it slightly more interesting, is, well, I might have an identity provider that's outside of that dev account. Maybe I want to federate into this world, which we talked about previously. Or maybe there's another account that I don't own, but I want to grant them access to do things within my environment. What you do in that case is, once again, you create a role in your, let's call it your master account, your entry point, right? In this case, I've dotted the lines, which basically saying is I'm using a managed policy to give that role exactly the same permissions as Anders had, so they can assume a role in the different projects and do the right thing, right? By doing that, it means they get access to all this information, data within the account, and data in all the other accounts that are related to it. Now, if you have other identity providers outside, like an external identity provider, this could be your Active Directory on-premise, where you're federating in through SAML. Or in the bottom, as I had, there's an Acme account that needs access, and they come in through the same entry point, so you manage all the access through 1 entry point. And specifically, if you use the external identity provider, as I said, I've not created a single user in that case in my accounts. All I'm doing is using roles and the federation functionality that we have, and you can still do the switch role pieces within the account, in the accounts to get access to all the information. So, quickly show how this works. Once again, we got Bob, and he has that policy, that's fine. So we're gonna attach a policy to Bob. And, oh, there it is. This is a switch role policy. And let's quickly look at what the switch role policy does. You recognize this from a previous slide that I had that talked about the setup. All this policy has is give Bob the right to assume a role in another account. That's all it does, nothing else. Now, it happens to be that I'm using the same account, and this is only for demo purposes, but you can use the functionality also to display those bits and pieces. So if we now go back to Bob, and as I said, Bob in this case, if you try to go in and do anything with, product equals to blue, he gets access denied, so he doesn't have those permissions, right? Oh, that's actually what I'm gonna show, sorry. Apologize, I wanted to show you the role that I created for this, just to show what it does. I have a role called product equals to blue. Remember the policy I had to give access to any resource that was tagged with blue? It's the same policy, it's a managed policy, and I assigned it to a role. So if we look at it, it gives the access to do things with product equals to blue. So that's basic setup and the resource side. I created a role, defined what it can get access to, and I defined that Anders can go in and assume the role, and Bob can go assume the role. So how do I switch? Up in the right-hand corner, there's something down here that calls switch role. And it will get you to a page and will ask you for the account. And you can either provide the account ID, or you can provide the name of the account, which I do here, it's Viking. I happen to know what the name, I've demoed this a couple of times, so I know how it works. And I can pick a color that basically represents this specific switch role functionality. For this case, I'm gonna pick a blue color. You click switch role. Now what you notice up in the right-hand corner, it says product, you see a blue circle around it. That's basically the indicator that you are now in a different account. You're not viewing the account you originally were in. And as you can see, I'm now still in the EC2 space. If I now pick the blue one that I tried to start previously, and do a start, it will start the instance. But if we go back to the S3 permissions, remember the only policy on the role was the policy that gives access to product equals to blue. If I go back to S3, there's an access denied. I can easily switch back by basically going and saying, back to Bob, takes me back. I'm now in the S3 console and now I have access. So you can see it as a mechanism, as I said, going from one account to another. You can also use it within an account as a way of delegating admin access. It might be that Anders normally only has S3, but then he needs access to do some admin functionality. We'll use the switch role functionality in that case. That means they don't have the permissions all the time. And once again, it's roles, so all these credentials keep rotating on a regular basis. So let's see what we're doing on time. So what did we cover? We covered the top 10, rather top 11 best practices. So anybody who's old enough to see in the movie Spinal Tap understands why we're doing 11. IAM users versus federated users. Best practice, the best way of looking at versus is always use federated users if you can. It is better security hygiene. It gives you security credential rotation on a regular basis. You don't have to worry about and think about those pieces. And you're managing all your identities in one spot. Inline policy, access keys versus passwords, once again, it's dependent on your use case. Now, if you're using federated users, there's no need for passwords, and there's no need for access keys. You can single sign on into the console as a federated user. Inline policies versus managed policies, groups versus managed policies. Always go with managed policies as much as you can. It's a better way of managing. It gives you better control. It allows you to delegate admin permissions, to assign policies or permissions to users in your space. If you can use tag-based control, so it depends on which services you're using today, but it actually, you can see, it actually gives you flexibility and takes away some of the management burden on yourself, given that resources automatically gets managed if they get tagged appropriately. And then one account, multiple accounts, it's pretty much you have to figure out what the right thing is for you. But a lot of our customers really, so the majority have multiple accounts, and it's usually the path that you guys go down because of isolation reasons. There's two related sessions I strongly recommend you go to. I've sort of like brushed a little bit on some of the policy stuff. There's a session tomorrow that goes through in detail all the policy nitpicking, sorry. The Ninja in 60 minutes. The policies I showed you, he will go in more detail of what to do with it. He will go in more details about conditions, and you will get to learn more about the policy language than you ever wanted to learn. It's an excellent session to use as a follow-up to this. And then the 307 will teach you anything you want to know about federation in detail. As I said, federation should be your primary way of giving users access within your space. So I strongly recommend going to that one as well. Lastly, please fill out the evaluation form, not so much for me, it's for the overall event. We use all these evaluations to make sure we raise the bar, make sure we give you the sessions that you want to hear and all the data that you want. So please fill them out, and I think there's some swag that gets given away if you fill out the forms as well. And with that, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest.